They sold the world a beautiful illusion of rock and roll rebellion. But behind the stage lights, many music historians argue their success became a heavy, fatal burden. Drummer Keith Moon died swallowing pills meant to cure his alcoholism. The quiet bassist John Entwistle suffered a fatal cocaine heart attack trying to escape staggering debt. Genius songwriter Pete Townshend drank himself into oblivion under the pressure. And frontman Roger Daltrey physically brutalized his own bandmates just to keep the machine running. Their reality was a violent chemical nightmare. Forget the glamorous myths. This is the crushing reality of how massive debt and a lethal addiction culture tore The Who apart from the inside out. It started as a genuine accident. In September 1964, the band played a cramped, sweaty gig at the Railway Hotel in West London. The venue ceiling was incredibly low. During a frenzied performance, Pete Townshend accidentally thrust the neck of his guitar upward. It cracked hard against the ceiling. The instrument broke. For a working-class musician in 1964, breaking a guitar was a financial disaster. Driven by sudden frustration, Townshend did not try to salvage it. He smashed the rest of the Rickenbacker guitar to pieces right there on the stage. The crowd was stunned into silence, then erupted. They had never seen raw anger expressed so violently on a stage. They assumed it was a calculated artistic statement. Word spread quickly. The following week, the crowd doubled. They came to see the destruction. But Townshend couldn't afford to break another guitar. Enter the band's managers, Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp. They were ruthless opportunists who viewed young bands as raw, exploitable material. They recognized Townshend's accident as a massive marketing gimmick. They saw the violence not as a financial loss, but as an investment, and they strictly demanded the destruction continue. Keith Moon immediately joined in, kicking over his expensive Premier drum kits. The audience roared. The Who rapidly became the most notorious live act in the country. But the entertainment industry operates on cold mathematics. Destroying custom equipment every single night is financial suicide. Every time Townshend smashed a guitar, he shattered his own wages. Every time Moon kicked a hole in a bass drum, he kicked a hole in their bank account. Soon, they owed staggering sums of money to instrument manufacturers and their own management. This crushing, inescapable debt exposed the incompatible personalities of the four men, turning their dressing rooms into war zones. Roger Daltrey, a former sheet metal worker, viewed the band as his only ticket out of factory poverty. He saw the smashed gear not as art, but as a direct threat to his livelihood, and he began to enforce brutal discipline to protect his income. Pete Townshend, the principal songwriter, became paralyzed by the intense anxiety of writing hit songs to pay off the mounting bills. Keith Moon masked his deep insecurities by embracing the chaos, using noise to drown out the terrifying pressure. Meanwhile, bassist John Entwistle absorbed the immense stress in complete silence, quietly internalizing the madness around him. According to several accounts, they were no longer completely free artists. They became heavily bound to their own destructive reputation. They were caught in a vicious cycle. Buy expensive gear, smash it to please the crowd, go into debt, and play more shows to pay it off. The management's solution to this financial hemorrhage was standard for the time: put the band on the road and never let them stop. To pay for the shattered wood and twisted metal, the four men were shoved onto freezing tour buses. They were forced to play upwards of 300 gigs a year. This relentless pace stripped the flesh from their bones. The stage was set. The debt was locked in. The physical exhaustion was peaking. Trapped in a cage of their own making, the friction between them ignited into physical violence. They desperately needed an escape from the nightmare they had created, leading them directly toward heavy chemical dependency. Management understood the mathematics of hype. If the audience expected a riot, it had to be delivered. The fans saw rock and roll gods dispensing with material possessions. The accountants in London, however, saw 4 young men willingly burying themselves in an avalanche of debt. The financial trap was perfectly executed through the standard industry practice of recoupable advances. The management and the record labels would front the money to buy the replacement amplifiers, the new guitars, and the fresh drum skins. To the band, it felt like they were being taken care of. But this money was not a gift. It was a high-interest loan. Every smashed Rickenbacker was added to a ledger. The band's royalties, their gig fees, and their publishing rights were all funneled directly back to the management to pay off this constantly expanding debt. Roger Daltrey, with his street-smart pragmatism, was the first to realize the terrifying reality of their situation. He was a man who had fought his way up from the absolute bottom, and he viewed money not as a luxury, but as a lifeline. He watched with mounting horror as Townshend splintered their profits against the stage floor and Moon stomped their financial security into pieces. Daltrey knew that despite their faces appearing on the covers of major music weeklies and their singles climbing the charts, they were functionally bankrupt. They were accumulating massive liabilities while operating under the illusion of immense success. The reality of touring the United Kingdom in the 1960s was a grim, punishing existence. There were no luxury tour buses, no private jets, and no dedicated catering teams. The 4 members of The Who, along with their roadies and their massive heavy equipment, were crammed into the back of an unheated, rattling Ford Transit van. They spent their lives hurtling up and down the poorly lit, dangerous arterial roads of Britain, existing on a diet of stale sandwiches from bleak transport cafes and lukewarm tea. They were expected to play up to 300 shows a year. Sometimes they were booked to play 2 different venues in a single night, driving frantically across the country in the freezing rain to meet their contractual obligations. This was not a life of glamour. It was a grueling, repetitive grind that rapidly began to strip the humanity from the men involved. The physical toll of this schedule was devastating. Pete Townshend was playing with such aggressive windmill-like ferocity that his fingers frequently bled over the pickguard of his guitar. He was destroying his hearing night after night, standing directly in front of towering stacks of Marshall amplifiers, pushed to their absolute distortion limits. His mind, already prone to severe anxiety, was being stretched to the breaking point as management constantly demanded new hit singles to keep the cash flow moving. He was expected to write masterpieces in the back of a freezing, vibrating van while his bandmates slept or argued. Roger Daltrey was shredding his vocal cords, trying to project his voice over the sheer, deafening volume of the band. He was the front man, the physical embodiment of the band's aggression, and he had to project an aura of total invincibility while internally panicking about the fact that they could barely afford petrol to get to the next gig. His resentment towards the other 3 was hardening into a cold, furious stone. He saw them as careless children who were actively sabotaging his only chance at a secure life. John Entwistle reacted to the crushing pressure by retreating entirely inward. The immobility he displayed on stage was not just a performance quirk, it was a psychological defense mechanism. Amidst the swirling chaos, the deafening noise, and the constant suffocating proximity of the other 3 men, Entwistle built a wall of absolute silence around himself. He internalized the stress, locking it away behind a deadpan expression. But internalizing that level of anxiety requires an outlet, and Entwistle would soon find his in quiet, devastatingly expensive vices that would haunt him to his grave. And then there was Keith Moon. Moon was the youngest, the most volatile, and the least equipped to handle the grueling reality of their existence. The van was a prison for a mind as hyperactive and deeply insecure as his. Moon could not tolerate silence or boredom. He needed constant stimulation, constant attention, and constant reassurance that he existed. The punishing schedule, the lack of sleep, and the looming financial dread terrified him. To cope, he developed a persona, the manic, unpredictable jester that he wore like armor. But armor is heavy, and wearing it 24 hours a day is exhausting. As the debt mounted and the miles in the freezing transit van accumulated, the sheer physical exhaustion began to mutate. The natural adrenaline of performing was no longer enough to keep them standing. Their bodies were failing, their nerves were frayed to the point of snapping, and the pressure from management to maintain their violent, destructive reputation was relentless. They were trapped in a cage made of their own success. They desperately needed something to keep them awake for the drives, something to give them the energy to smash the guitars they couldn't afford, and something to help them pass out when the ringing in their ears became unbearable. They needed a chemical solution to a mechanical problem. And in the murky, unregulated underworld of the 1960s club scene, that solution was readily available, cheap, and entirely lethal. The descent into heavy narcotics was not a celebratory indulgence of their fame. It was a grim, necessary tactic for sheer survival on the road, setting the stage for the violent internal wars that would soon tear them apart. The reality of drug use for a working-class band in the 1960s was completely devoid of romance or luxury. It was not an indulgence, it was utility. It functioned as an industrial lubricant designed to keep a broken machine running long after the engine should have seized. Their daily existence in 1965 and 1966 was a brutal test of endurance. They played hundreds of shows a year, frequently performing twice a night in different towns. The routine was a blur of exhausting travel, chronic sleep deprivation, and the suffocating tension of four vastly different men living out of each other's pockets. Their bodies were battered from the sheer kinetic violence of their stage act. Their ears rang with permanent high-pitched tinnitus. They ate garbage and lived under the constant knowledge that despite their fame, they were hopelessly in debt to their management and instrument suppliers. Human biology is not designed to withstand that level of sustained physical and psychological abuse. When adrenaline fails, the body shuts down. But the Who were not allowed to shut down. If they slept, they missed the gig. If they missed the gig, they breached their contract. They didn't get paid. The debt ballooned, and the threat of returning to the sheet metal factories and dead-end jobs became an immediate reality. They needed a mechanical solution. They found it in a little blue triangular pill known on the streets as a Purple Heart, Drenamol, a potent mixture of amphetamine and barbiturate. The media would later frame the mod culture's use of amphetamines as a dangerous youth rebellion, a hedonistic pursuit of pleasure. But for the Who, and for the working-class kids who followed them, amphetamines were working-class tools. You took them so you could work a grueling shift at the factory on Friday, dance all night on Saturday to escape the misery of your existence, and still be standing on Sunday. For the band, the pills were the only way to force their exhausted bodies out of the van and onto the stage. The drugs artificially tricked their nervous systems into believing they had energy. It allowed them to perform the violent, aggressive set that the crowd demanded and that their creditors required. But a chemical loan always comes with a crippling interest rate. When the amphetamines wore off, the crash was not merely physical exhaustion. It was a devastating psychological plunge into profound depression and anxiety. To survive the crash, to force their overstimulated brains to shut off so they could grab 2 hours of sleep on a motel floor, they required downers. They needed heavy tranquilizers, mandrax, and vast quantities of alcohol. They were no longer musicians regulating their own bodies. They were chemists engaged in a dangerous daily balancing act of uppers to work and downers to sleep. Within this chemical prison, the individual psychologies of the band members began to warp and fracture. The drugs did not unify them. The drugs isolated them, exacerbating their deepest insecurities and turning their internal dynamics into a ticking time bomb. Take Pete Townshend. Townshend was the primary songwriter, the intellectual engine of the band. The entire financial survival of The Who rested squarely on his narrow shoulders. He was acutely, painfully aware that if he did not write the next hit single, if he did not produce another My Generation or Substitute, the cash flow would stop, the creditors would descend, and the band would be destroyed. That level of pressure is enough to crush a healthy mind. Townshend's mind was not healthy. It was a chaotic, anxious storm. Townshend used alcohol and drugs to quiet the overwhelming noise in his own head. He drank cognac by the bottle not to celebrate, but to build a buffer between his fragile nervous system and the terrifying expectations of the world. He was writing brilliant, articulate anthems about teenage alienation and stuttering defiance, capturing the voice of a generation. Yet the man writing those lyrics felt entirely hollowed out, alienated from his own bandmates, and terrified of the violent monster he had helped create on stage. The alcohol numbed the stage fright, the amphetamines powered the windmills, and the cycle repeated until his grip on reality began to severely slip. Then there was Keith Moon. The music press built an entire industry around the myth of Moon the Loon, selling newspapers by detailing his legendary exploits. But the reality was far darker. Moon was a man consumed by a terrifying, bottomless insecurity. He suffered from profound imposter syndrome, constantly terrified that he was not good enough, that he would be exposed as a fraud, and that he would be abandoned. He possessed an agonizing inability to be alone with his own thoughts. Silence terrified him. If a room was quiet, he had to fill it with noise. If people were ignoring him, he had to force them to look at him, even if it meant destroying the room. The hotel room destruction was not a symptom of having too much money. It was a symptom of severe psychological distress. Moon was trapped in a relentless schedule, physically exhausted and emotionally isolated. He used chaos as a shield. If everyone was laughing at the crazy drummer who just blew up the plumbing, no one would look closely enough to see the terrified, exhausted young man underneath. To maintain this manic, cartoonish persona, Moon required monumental amounts of chemical assistance. He consumed everything he could get his hands on, amphetamines to fuel the relentless energy of his drumming and his offstage antics, and elephantine doses of alcohol and horse tranquilizers to bring himself down. He was using chemicals to completely obliterate his own consciousness because the reality of his existence, the pressure, the debt, the grueling travel, was too painful to process sober. He wasn't partying. He was actively, aggressively fleeing from his own mind. In stark contrast to Moon's explosive decline was the quiet, terrifying consumption of John Entwistle. Entwistle was the immovable object on stage, the silent giant who anchored the erratic flying elements of Townshend and Moon. Because he did not smash his bass or scream into the microphone, the press and the public largely assumed he was the stable, sensible one. This was a fatal miscalculation. Entwistle coped with the suffocating madness of The Who by retreating behind a wall of absolute stoicism. But the stress of the debt, the grueling road, and the constant violent bickering of his bandmates still had to be processed. Entwistle internalized it. He built a thicker, heavier armor, and to reinforce that armor, he matched the drug and alcohol intake of his bandmates. Drink for drink, pill for pill, he simply did it quietly. He was the silent consumer, using cocaine and whiskey to maintain his frozen exterior while the internal pressure cooked him alive. He was trapped in the exact same financial and physical nightmare, but he refused to scream. By 1966, the band was a walking medical emergency. They created music that defined freedom for millions of teenagers around the globe. Yet they were slaves to a schedule and a chemical regimen that actively destroyed their central nervous systems. Chemically and emotionally, the four men were thousands of miles away from each other. But there was one man in that van who was not retreating into the chemical void. There was one man who was watching this descent with a cold, clear, and utterly furious perspective. Roger Daltrey was not an art school visionary, and he was not a fragile soul looking for an escape. He was a survivor. Daltrey looked at the amphetamines, the empty cognac bottles, and the erratic, destructive behavior of his bandmates, and he did not feel pity. He felt an overwhelming, violently defensive rage. Daltrey knew exactly what the drugs were doing. They were not just destroying the health of Townshend, Moon, and Entwistle. They were actively threatening to destroy the band. And the band was Daltrey's only asset. It was his only leverage against the crushing poverty of his youth. Every time Keith Moon was too drunk to keep time, every time Pete Townshend was too strung out to play the right chords, Daltrey saw his own future being casually flushed down the drain by men he considered weak and undisciplined. The chemicals had stripped away whatever thin veneer of camaraderie had ever existed between them. Rational dialogue was impossible. You cannot negotiate with a man who has been awake for 3 days on amphetamines, nor can you reason with a man who has numbed his brain with horse tranquilizers. The pressure of the massive debt was pushing from the outside. The chemical paranoia was pushing from the inside. The air in the dressing rooms was thick with unspoken hatred and raw, jagged nerves. The band had reached a critical mass. The drugs had created an environment where words no longer held any weight. The only currency left was force. And Roger Daltrey, a man who had learned how to survive on the streets, was perfectly willing to use force to protect his investment. The brutal violence that became the operational standard of the band stemmed directly from the incompatible personalities trapped inside their dressing room. The Who was not a democracy. It was not a brotherhood united by a shared artistic vision. It was a ticking bomb of class resentment, severe anxiety, and survival instincts sharpened on the unforgiving streets of post-war London. The core of this explosive dynamic was the profound, irreconcilable divide between Pete Townshend and Roger Daltrey. Townshend was the architect of their sound. He was an art school dropout, a young man whose mind was a chaotic, churning engine of grand concepts, deep-seated insecurities, and nervous energy. Townshend viewed the band as a canvas for his escalating artistic ambitions. But the pressure of being the sole intellectual provider for a band drowning in equipment debt was crushing him. He was terrified of failure. He used his height, his aggressive windmill guitar playing, and his erratic drug-fueled behavior as a shield to hide the fact that he was constantly paralyzingly anxious about their financial ruin and his own creative limits. Roger Daltrey was the exact opposite. He was a pragmatist. He was a tough, uncompromising street fighter who had clawed his way out of a factory life that he absolutely despised. For Daltrey, The Who was not a vehicle for high art or teenage rebellion. It was a strictly functioning business. It was a machine designed to generate income, pay the bills, and keep him from ever having to put on a factory uniform again. This fundamental difference in worldview turned their working environment into a toxic wasteland. Daltrey looked at his bandmates, Townshend with his neuroses, John Entwistle with his silent, expensive consumption, and Keith Moon with his manic, destructive need for attention, and he felt a profound, sickening disgust. Daltrey did not hate their rampant drug use because he possessed some high-minded moral objection to narcotics. He hated it because of the cold, hard economics. Drugs made the band sloppy. A sloppy band played terrible shows. Terrible shows meant promoters wouldn't book them, audiences wouldn't buy the records, and the fragile house of cards that kept their creditors at bay would collapse. He watched Keith Moon swallowing handfuls of amphetamines to stay awake and washing them down with brandy to stop the shakes, and Daltrey saw a man actively sabotaging his livelihood. He saw Townshend drinking himself into a stupor before gigs to calm his nerves, and Daltrey saw a liability that could cost him everything he had fought for. In the back of a freezing Ford Transit van, logic vanished. The chemicals had completely destroyed their ability to communicate, leaving physical force as Daltrey's only remaining tool. The pressure cooker finally exploded in September 1965. The Who had been booked for a grueling, poorly organized tour of Scandinavia. They were exhausted, freezing, and heavily in debt. The shows in Denmark were a disaster. The band sounded atrocious. Keith Moon, heavily under the influence of smuggled amphetamines, was playing with a frantic, completely unhinged erraticism, speeding up the tempo until the songs fell apart. Townshend was equally impaired. His guitar work sloppy and aggressive. Daltrey, whose vocal cords were shredded from trying to scream over the chaotic noise, was furious. He was standing on stage watching the professional reputation he relied on for survival being dismantled by men who were too high to care. After a particularly disastrous gig, the band retreated to their dressing room. The atmosphere was venomous. Daltrey did not want to talk about the set list or the sound mix. He wanted the drugs gone. He began searching the dressing room, violently tearing through bags and coats. He found exactly what he was looking for: a massive stash of illegal amphetamine pills that Keith Moon had smuggled into the country to keep the band functioning through the tour. Daltrey did not hesitate. He did not ask Moon for an explanation. He grabbed the pills, walked directly to the dressing room toilet, and dumped the entire stash into the bowl, flushing away their only chemical lifeline. When Moon realized what Daltrey had done, he reacted with the frantic, terrified rage of an addict losing his supply. He lunged at Daltrey, screaming. What followed was not a scuffle. It was not a minor disagreement. It was a brutal, one-sided physical dismantling. Roger Daltrey, built of muscle from years of manual labor and fueled by the absolute terror of losing his career, systematically beat Keith Moon to a bloody pulp. He used his bare hands to punch the drummer to the floor, delivering a savage beating that left Moon bruised, bloodied, and utterly humiliated in front of his bandmates. Townshend and Entwistle, horrified and likely impaired themselves, intervened, but the damage was done. The illusion of a band of brothers was permanently shattered on the floor of a Danish dressing room. Daltrey stood over the wreckage of the fight, completely unrepentant. He had sent a clear, undeniable message: if you jeopardize the band, I will physically destroy you. The immediate aftermath of the Denmark incident reveals the sheer dysfunction of the music industry. The rest of the band, terrified of Daltrey's capacity for violence and furious at his dictatorial control, fired him on the spot. They told management that Roger Daltrey was no longer the lead singer of The Who. They returned to London fractured, convinced they could simply hire a more compliant frontman and carry on. But within days, a terrifying cold reality began to set in for Townshend, Entwistle, and Moon. Without Daltrey, they were not a functioning band. They were three deeply flawed, chemically dependent young men surrounded by sharks. The management did not care about their internal disputes. They cared about the debt. The creditors did not care that the singer was a bully. They cared about their money. Townshend realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he did not possess the ruthless organizational skills or the physical intimidation required to keep Keith Moon in line, or to force John Entwistle out of his shell, or even to keep himself grounded. They needed Daltrey. They needed his anger. They needed his absolute terrifying commitment to the survival of the band. Without his iron-fisted discipline, they would simply dissolve into a puddle of unpaid bills, missed gigs, and drug overdoses within a month. It was the ultimate humiliation. The visionaries, the brilliant musicians, the architects of the new mod sound had to swallow their pride, pick up the phone, and beg their abuser to return. Daltrey agreed to come back, but on his terms. He demanded a promise of a drug-free dressing room and absolute professionalism on stage. The band agreed, though it was a promise they would repeatedly break in secret. The Denmark incident of 1965 fundamentally altered the DNA of The Who. From that moment forward, the band operated under a dark, unspoken extortion. They were no longer held together by the joy of playing music. They were held together by the very real threat of physical violence and the crushing weight of their shared financial obligations. Roger Daltrey became the warden of a very profitable, highly dysfunctional prison. Every time they stepped onto a stage to perform the anthems of youth rebellion that made them famous, they did so knowing that the man singing into the microphone was willing to beat them unconscious if they missed a cue. The backstage area was no longer a place of preparation. It became a hostile space where the four men existed in a state of hyper-vigilant paranoia. They had successfully locked themselves into an abusive marriage because divorce meant financial ruin. The guitars would continue to smash, the drum kits would continue to explode, and the crowds would continue to scream, entirely unaware that the violent energy radiating from the stage was not an act. It was the desperate, furious reality of four men who hated the situation they were in, hated the debts they owed, and increasingly hated each other. And out of this venomous, toxic wasteland, driven by the sheer necessity to survive, they were about to walk into the recording studio and produce some of the greatest artistic achievements in the history of rock music. By the late 1960s, the recording studio was not a sanctuary or a place of collaborative brotherhood. It was a claustrophobic bunker where four men, harboring deep-seated resentments, were forced into close proximity by the crushing weight of their financial obligations. They did not enter IBC studios in London to explore their artistic boundaries. They entered because there was a metaphorical gun pressed firmly to their heads. The ammunition in that gun was debt. The agonizing psychological environment that birthed their greatest work was driven entirely by their ledger in 1968. Despite having a string of hit singles, relentless touring, and widespread fame, The Who were functionally bankrupt. The gimmick of smashing equipment had caught up to them with a vengeance. They were hundreds of thousands of pounds in the red. Their management, Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp, were desperately shuffling money between accounts just to keep the creditors from seizing the band's amplifiers. The message from management to Pete Townshend was brutally clear. Write a masterpiece or the band goes into receivership and you all go back to the factories. This was the suffocating reality that birthed Tommy, the album that would solidify their legacy as the intellectual titans of rock and roll. The first rock opera was not born out of a joyous burst of creative freedom. It was born out of absolute blinding panic. Townshend, already a bundle of severe neuroses, was pushed to the absolute brink of psychological collapse. He was carrying the entire financial survival of 4 men on his shoulders. He isolated himself, writing obsessively, pouring his deepest traumas, his anxieties, and his frantic spiritual searching into a sprawling, complex narrative about a deaf, dumb, and blind boy. But writing the masterpiece is only half the battle. The true agony of The Who was the process of actually recording it. The studio sessions were toxic. Townshend was bringing deeply vulnerable, highly sensitive, and profoundly personal material into a room filled with men who fundamentally did not understand him, and, in Daltrey's case, actively despised his erratic behavior. Roger Daltrey was a pragmatic, street-smart survivor who looked at Townshend's sprawling rock opera with deep suspicion. Daltrey did not care about the spiritual enlightenment of a fictional deaf, dumb, and blind boy. He cared about whether the songs had a strong enough hook to sell millions of copies, and finally clear the crushing debt that kept him awake at night. Yet the cruel irony of The Who's dynamic dictated that Townshend could not sing his own masterpiece. His voice was too thin, too fragile to project the necessary power over the thunderous rhythm section. He needed Daltrey's roaring, muscular, working-class baritone. The vocal booth became a site of cold, mechanical transaction. Daltrey stood behind the glass, aggressively gripping the microphone, acting as the mouthpiece for a man he frequently wanted to strangle. Townshend stood in the control room, pressing the talkback button, intensely directing Daltrey on how to emote his deepest personal traumas. There was no brotherly affection in these exchanges. It was a tense, venomous negotiation. Daltrey sang the lyrics with terrifying, aggressive power, not because he felt Townshend's spiritual pain, but because he was channeling his own furious frustration at being trapped in this financial nightmare. He was singing for his life, trying to scream his way out of debt. Behind Daltrey, the rhythm section was fighting its own bizarre, isolated war. Keith Moon was entirely incapable of playing standard time. He did not play the drums to support a song. He played the drums to completely obliterate silence. The studio environment terrified Moon. He lacked the discipline required for meticulous recording. To cope with the tedious hours of repetitive takes, Moon consumed staggering quantities of alcohol and pills, smuggling brandy and amphetamines into the vocal booths. His erratic behavior forced Townshend to act as the band's metronome, playing highly rhythmic lead guitar just to keep the songs from collapsing under the weight of Moon's chaotic, chemical-fueled drum fills. In the corner stood John Entwistle, the silent giant. While Townshend and Daltrey engaged in verbal sparring and Moon desperately tried to secure the attention of the room, Entwistle simply plugged in and turned his amplifiers up to deafening levels. Entwistle was a virtuoso bass player, but his playing style was born out of sheer defensive necessity. To be heard over Moon's manic drumming and Townshend's aggressive chords, Entwistle had to play the bass like a lead instrument. He stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask, tallying his own mounting personal debts in his head while his fingers flew across the fretboard. He refused to engage in the bickering. His silence was his armor, but the internal pressure was slowly, quietly cooking him alive. When Tommy was released in 1969, it was a colossal world-shifting success. It completely redefined the parameters of rock music. The critics lauded them as geniuses. The money finally began to pour in, temporarily holding the creditors at bay. But success did not cure the disease, it merely mutated the symptoms. The influx of wealth and critical acclaim in the 1970s did not bring peace to the fractured group. It simply allowed them to build larger, more expensive arenas for their internal warfare. By the early 1970s, as they prepared to record their next sprawling narrative, Quadrophenia, the band decided to build their own recording studio in Battersea, London. It was called Ramport Studios. It was supposed to be a state-of-the-art sanctuary where they could work without the ticking clock of hourly rental fees. Instead, Ramport became a colossal, suffocating money pit. The construction was a disaster, plagued by delays, technical failures, and massive cost overruns. The band had successfully managed to put themselves right back into a state of severe financial terror. The stress of Ramport acted as a violent accelerant on the already toxic relationship between Townshend and Daltrey. The brutal discipline that Daltrey had established years earlier in Denmark was still the governing law of the band. Daltrey still viewed Townshend's erratic, alcohol-soaked behavior as a direct threat to the band's survival. Townshend, now grappling with the immense pressure of following up a massive hit while managing a failing studio build, was drinking heavily, and his temper was completely frayed. The tension finally snapped at Shepperton Studios during rehearsals for the upcoming tour. A seemingly trivial argument regarding the backing tracks ignited the room. Townshend, fueled by immense stress and alcohol, began screaming at Daltrey, hurling insults. Daltrey did not engage in a shouting match. He reverted instantly to the street survival instincts of his youth. Townshend, in a fit of absolute blind rage, swung a heavy guitar at Daltrey's head. It was a move that could have caused severe permanent injury. Daltrey dodged the swinging wood. He did not call for security. Daltrey stepped inside Townshend's reach, clenched his fist, and delivered a devastating singular punch directly to the guitarist's face. Townshend was knocked completely unconscious before he even hit the ground. He lay entirely motionless. This was the horrific, violent reality of their operation. The men who wrote complex, intellectual narratives about British youth were fully capable of brutalizing each other on the rehearsal floor. When Townshend eventually regained consciousness, he was hauled into the back of an ambulance and taken to the hospital. Daltrey did not apologize. He felt entirely justified. In Daltrey's mind, he had neutralized a threat to the recording process. He had maintained discipline, the only way the band understood. The fact that they managed to finish Quadrophenia, an album widely considered to be their absolute masterpiece, featuring some of the most intricate, powerful, and emotionally resonant rock music ever recorded, is a testament to the terrifying compartmentalization of the human mind. They would bleed on the studio floor, wipe their faces, step into the vocal booth, and produce art of staggering beauty. They were not creating music because they loved each other. They were creating music because they were bound together by an unbreakable chain of debt, contractual obligations, and a shared, terrifying realization that they were entirely incapable of surviving outside the violent ecosystem they had built. The studio was not a place of creation. It was a factory floor where they aggressively mined their own trauma for profit. You cannot run a heavy industrial machine at maximum capacity, fuel it with highly volatile chemicals, deny it maintenance, and expect it to survive. For a decade and a half, The Who operated as the most destructive engine in the British music industry. The four men had somehow survived the crushing debts of their early equipment-smashing days, the grueling touring schedules, and the physical assaults within their own dressing rooms. But survival in this ecosystem was an illusion. They were merely delaying the consequences. The brawls in the studio and the shattered guitars were just the prelude. The industry that had relentlessly squeezed them for every drop of adrenaline and every penny of profit was about to collect its non-negotiable fee, and it would be paid in the currency of human lives. The deaths of Keith Moon and John Entwistle are rarely viewed by biographers as glamorous rock and roll casualties. Many accounts suggest they were tragic victims of a relentless financial system and severe chemical dependency. The tragedy begins with Keith Moon. By his final days in 1978, the physical reality of Keith Moon was severe. He was only 32 years old, yet he possessed the bloated, severely damaged physiology of a man in his late 50s. The relentless consumption of amphetamines, cocaine, horse tranquilizers, and monumental quantities of brandy had systematically destroyed his liver, his nervous system, and his mind. The public was still demanding Moon the Loon. They expected the manic jester who blew up hotel toilets and drove cars into swimming pools. They wanted the cartoon character, but the man inside the cartoon was utterly terrified, profoundly lonely, and physically incapable of maintaining the act. By the time the band recorded their 1978 album, Who Are You?, Moon's deterioration was no longer a backstage secret. It was a glaring professional liability. The drummer, who had once played with a frantic, explosive brilliance that redefined the instrument, could barely keep time. His muscle memory was gone, erased by alcohol. He was struggling to navigate standard 4/4 time signatures. Pete Townshend and Roger Daltrey, furious and panicked, were forced to brutally confront him, threatening to fire him from the only job he had ever known if he did not get himself clean. This is the cruelest psychological trap of addiction within the music industry. The band demanded that Moon stop drinking to save his career, but the entire architecture of his life, the crushing pressure of his fame, the massive tax bills forcing him into exile, and his agonizing inability to sit alone in a quiet room was exactly what drove him to drink in the first place. He was commanded to fix his brain while still trapped inside the machine that had broken it. Moon desperately wanted to live. He did not possess a romantic death wish. He was deeply afraid of dying and terrified of being replaced. In a desperate bid to dry out, he sought the help of a prominent Harley Street physician. The medical intervention that followed was not a carefully monitored rehabilitation program. It was a staggering miscalculation. The doctor prescribed Moon a drug called hymidine. Hymidine is a powerful, heavy sedative, primarily used in strictly controlled inpatient hospital settings to combat the acute, dangerous symptoms of alcohol withdrawal. It is a drug that suppresses the central nervous system, and it is highly lethal if misused or combined with alcohol. giving a man with Keith Moon's established history of chronic, uncontrolled substance abuse a massive bottle of unmonitored heminuverin pills. To take it home is the equivalent of handing a loaded firearm to a severely depressed man. On the evening of September 6, 1978, Moon attended a film premiere in London hosted by Paul McCartney. The attendees noted that Moon was uncharacteristically quiet, subdued, and sober. He was trying to follow the rules. He returned to his rented flat in Mayfair, a flat owned by Harry Nilsson, and grimly, the exact same apartment where singer Cass Elliot had died 4 years earlier. In the early hours of the morning, the agonizing cravings for alcohol began to set in. Moon was terrified of the withdrawal shakes. He was a man who lacked all capacity for patience or moderation. If one pill could take the edge off, he reasoned, a handful of pills would cure him instantly. Keith Moon ingested 32 heminuverin tablets. It was not a suicide. It was a panicked, botched attempt at self-medication by a man who had spent his entire adult life using chemicals to solve his problems. He was trying to silence the terrifying noise in his head. The massive overdose of sedatives systematically shut down his respiratory system. He fell asleep and simply stopped breathing. The bitter, sickening irony of Keith Moon's death cannot be overstated. He did not die choking on his own vomit after a wild, multi-day heroin binge. He did not die in a spectacular high-speed car crash. He died from a massive overdose of the exact medication legally prescribed by a doctor to help him get sober. He was a man who used a lethal handful of chemicals in a desperate, failed attempt to escape chemicals. When the news broke, it permanently shattered the core of The Who. The explosive, chaotic heartbeat of the band was gone, but the financial machinery of the band did not stop for grief. Townshend, Daltrey, and Entwistle were heavily in debt, bound by massive touring contracts and recording obligations. They were forced to hire a replacement drummer and march back onto the stage, dragging the ghost of their dead bandmate behind them. The grieving process was suffocated by the immediate, practical need to generate revenue. The tragedy of The Who did not stop with the loud, chaotic drummer. The financial guillotine that was constructed in 1964 simply shifted its target to the quietest man in the room. John Entwistle was the stoic, silent foundation of the band. On stage, he stood perfectly immobile, his fingers flying across the bass fretboard while Townshend leaped into the air and Daltrey swung his microphone. Because Entwistle did not engage in the bloody dressing room fistfights, and because he did not blow up hotel toilets, the public and the press widely assumed he was the stable, sensible anchor of the group. This was a fatal misreading of human psychology. Entwistle's silence was not stability, it was a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. To survive the suffocating madness of The Who, the relentless physical violence between Townshend and Daltrey, the deafening volume of the stage, and the constant, terrifying pressure of the band's financial instability, Entwistle completely internalized his stress. He built a wall of absolute stoicism. But internalizing decades of severe psychological trauma requires a massive release valve. Entwistle could not scream, so he spent. Entwistle developed a pathological, entirely uncontrolled compulsion for material hoarding. It was a direct psychological response to the trauma of his youth. When you spend your 20s watching your bandmates physically smash your collective earnings to pieces on stage every single night, leaving you completely bankrupt despite your fame, you overcompensate in your 50s. Entwistle sought security in indestructible, expensive objects. He purchased a sprawling 52-room country estate called Corwood in Gloucestershire. The maintenance costs alone were staggering. To fill the massive rooms, he engaged in frantic, obsessive spending sprees. He bought hundreds of custom-made, priceless bass guitars that he never played. He bought literal suits of medieval armor. He purchased a fleet of luxury vehicles, including custom Rolls-Royces, despite the fact that he rarely drove them. It was a desperate, hollow attempt to buy peace of mind. He was trying to construct a physical fortress of wealth to protect himself from the terrifying financial insecurity that had defined his early career. But a fortress of that size requires a monumental, continuous influx of cash. The objects he hoarded did not provide security. They provided massive, inescapable tax liabilities. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, John Entwistle was trapped in a financial nightmare that rivaled the worst days of the 1960s. He owed staggering sums of money to the British Inland Revenue. His accounts were frozen. He was facing the very real threat of losing his sprawling estate and everything inside it. The loop of debt had re-engaged and it was tightening around his neck. While Pete Townshend had managed to eventually achieve sobriety and secure his financial future through lucrative publishing rights, and Roger Daltrey had carefully managed his income through various business ventures, Entwistle was drowning. The man who had stood perfectly still on stage for 40 years was now running faster than anyone else on a terrifying financial treadmill. This brings us to the grim, unforgiving reality of the year 2002. The Who were preparing to embark on a massive, highly anticipated tour of the United States. They were no longer young, hungry men trying to conquer the world. They were men in their late 50s, carrying the heavy physical and mental scars of a lifetime in the rock industry. Why was John Entwistle, a 57-year-old man with a known history of high blood pressure and a severely weakened cardiovascular system, preparing to subject his aging body to the grueling, punishing physical demands of a major American rock tour? He was not doing it for the love of the music. He was not doing it to connect with the fans. He was doing it because he was entirely, utterly broke. He had to play. He was a prisoner of his own spending habits and the crushing demands of his creditors. He was going on tour to save his house. But a 57-year-old body cannot naturally sustain the adrenaline required to play a 2-hour set of highly aggressive rock music night after night. Furthermore, a 57-year-old mind paralyzed by the sheer terror of bankruptcy and the humiliation of financial ruin cannot naturally find the motivation to stand under those stage lights. Entwistle needed a chemical crutch to force his failing body through the motions and to temporarily numb the overwhelming anxiety of his debts. He relied on cocaine. He did not use cocaine to party like a young rock star in a VIP club. He used cocaine as a brutal, utilitarian tool. It was the industrial lubricant required to force a tired, stressed, indebted older man to function within the unforgiving machinery of the Who. It provided the artificial energy required to play the complex bass lines, and it provided the artificial confidence required to ignore the looming threat of the tax man. On June 27, 2002, the Who were stationed at the Hard Rock Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. They were scheduled to begin their grueling U.S. tour the very next day. Entwistle retreated to his hotel room. He was thousands of miles away from the fortress of Corwood that he was desperately trying to save. He was alone with the crushing weight of his financial obligations and the physical dread of the impending tour. He turned to his coping mechanism. He ingested a significant quantity of cocaine. The human heart is a mechanical pump. and John Entwistle's pump was already severely compromised by decades of silent internalized stress, a poor diet, and years of prior substance abuse. The sudden massive influx of cocaine caused his coronary arteries to violently spasm and constrict. The blood supply to his heart was immediately cut off. John Entwistle suffered a massive fatal heart attack. He died alone in a corporate hotel room in the Nevada desert. The media immediately sensationalized his death, focusing on the presence of cocaine and a local stripper who had been in the room earlier in the evening. They printed lurid headlines about the aging rock star dying in a blaze of rock and roll glory. But there was no glory in room 658 of the Hard Rock Hotel. There was only the grim, inevitable conclusion of a 40-year financial trap. Entwistle was not a victim of a wild party gone wrong. He was the ultimate victim of the exact same predatory financial mechanics that had forced Pete Townshend to smash his guitars in 1964. The machinery of the entertainment industry had demanded that he destroy his youth to pay off the debts of their stage act. Then, it demanded that he destroy his old age to pay off the debts of his trauma-induced hoarding. The loop of financial ruin trapped him to his very last breath. He died a working stiff, grinding away on the road to pay the bills, reliant on lethal chemicals simply to maintain the necessary pace. With Entwistle's death, the original rhythm section was gone, both men ultimately crushed by the very machine they helped to build. Today, Townshend and Daltrey carry the legacy alone, bearing permanent physical and psychological scars. The Who achieved staggering greatness, but the final accounting was paid entirely in grief and premature death. It leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable question. At what point does uncompromising genius become a fight for sheer survival?